and welcome to What a Scream, the podcast where myself and my special guests discuss horror films, and in particular, horror films that encompass a particular subject or genre that I've pulled randomly out of a hat. I have always wanted to start a podcast, especially when it comes to horror films. I love horror. I love dissecting horror films. I love looking at horror films as a way that mirrors real life. And what better time to start doing that than the times we're living in at the moment? Even though this will be going out in February, I am currently recording in January. So we are in our third lockdown in Ireland. And going through this global pandemic is something of a horror film, but we will get through it. If everyone is being safe and careful and smart, we will get through it. And I hope everyone is doing okay, because it is hard times, you know. We've all had to find ways of dealing with this new norm, whether it's upping your medication or going on medication, or finding creative ways of dealing with this whole shit show of a world right now, or whether it's just doing nothing and taking time to self-care and just be at one with what is the norm at the moment. So, as I said, every episode of this podcast, I'm going to have a special guest on, and my special guest for the very first episode is Emma Tyrrell, who is a good friend, and she is also a forensic psychologist and also a massive horror fan as well. I thought getting someone with a psychology background would be a great first episode, and especially seeing as the subject I picked out was female killers. Completely at random, it just so happened that it would have been the perfect subject for Emma to discuss. So here it is. This was my conversation with Emma, and our discussion about two particular films, Alice, Sweet Alice, which is a 1970s film, and Audition, which is a Japanese horror film from the 90s. So I would like to introduce my very first guest on this podcast. On the very first episode, I'm so excited to have my friend Emma Tyrrell on the podcast. Welcome to What a Scream.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So would you like to tell everyone who you are and what you do?
Of course. So, yeah, my name is Emma Tyrrell, and I'm a forensic psychologist. So I essentially study crime, criminals, victims, and everything in between.
That sounds like fun.
Yeah.
And how did you get into that field of study?
So I was doing my undergrad in applied psychology in IEDT, and one of our modules was forensic psychology, and I didn't even know that this was a field of study I could go into. But from the first day, I was like, right, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. And from there, I did a master's in forensic psychology as well in Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and I've just been kind of working on and off since. So.
Okay, that's very cool. And what is your relationship like with the genre of horror?
Oh, we have a very close relationship. I just love it. I find it really cathartic. I was exposed to kind of horror movies by sneaking downstairs and watching through a crack of a door.
Yeah, I think that was a lot of people's beginning into horror films, wasn't it?
Definitely. It's just like kind of like, oh, what's this? And you know you're not supposed to watch it, so it adds to the kind of scariness of it, I suppose.
Definitely.
So yeah, it was just from a really young age I started watching them, and I also have older brothers, so there's a few years in between us, so they were well into these kind of genres, different types of horror films as well. So I got kind of exposed through that too, and the love affair started then and has continued, if not grown even more.
So. Yeah, I think that's a lot of people's introduction, is they either have elder siblings or they've accidentally sneaked a wee peek at horror films. Because I know, like, my older sister, she was a lot older than me, so she was out of the house by the time I was kind of getting into movies. But my parents would always be watching like the X-Files, and I'd always be sneaking a peek, but absolutely terrified at the same time. Like, but it was almost like an addiction to being scared, and that's how I got into it. Like,
100%. Like, yeah, it is that thing of you're just like, you're terrified, but you can't look away, kind of thing. Yeah, no.
And did your love of horror kind of
influence perhaps the want to go into psychology or forensic psychology, especially when we've got films that are classed as horror, but they're also like based on killers, villains, serial killers, especially stuff like Silence of the Lambs or Seven. Did that in any way influence you at all?
Oh, 100%. Like, I think before I knew what forensic psychology was, I was just obsessed with why people did what they did. I was always so fascinated, both from like, say, like the killer's point of view and also the victim's point of view of like how they ended up in the situation that they're in and what their reactions were. Um, I always just wanted to know the whys of what was going on. And then especially like a lot of the times you would be given some sort of background to why the killer was doing what they do, or there was a catalyst in their lives, or they were like, you know, went through quite a bit in their childhood, and then that's how they would try and explain it. Like sometimes you wouldn't find out till like the sequels, but you know, it was there. And if you didn't know, you try to figure it out yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that's what kind of made me so fascinated by it. And then, as you said, like there's so many depictions of actual based on true stories of actual killings that have happened. And so basically I would always watch a lot of documentaries of these actual true crime killers and stuff, but then see them depicted within those films. And I always just thought it would be fascinating in the way that they interpreted it as well. So
yeah, of course. I mean, I know when I was younger, I became obsessed with serial killers, and I remember going to the local library and checking out books. I must have been about 11 or 12 at the time, and checking out books on serial killers. And I remember the librarian having to like call my mom and be like, hey, do you know what your daughter's like checking out? Maybe you should be. My mom's like, yeah, no, she's grand. But that always joined on. I really loved Criminal Minds because I loved that kind of like looking at the psychology of criminals and why they're doing it. And I think that's what got me really hooked on horror as well. True life horror. I don't know what it is like. It's just this addiction to true life horror as well as fantasy horror. But at the same time, as you said earlier, it's cathartic, you know. Like I've heard people say that obsession with true crime is like you want to know what's out there and you want to know how to deal with it and whether you have a better way of dealing with these horrors. And that's why you become so obsessed with it. Do you feel that that's kind of correct?
Yeah, I think it's really accurate. I think they've kind of seen it throughout, like when they've studied like horror films in terms of like psychology and stuff. They were saying that essentially the whole factor of being scared but in a safe environment is actually really good for like kind of coming up with ways to deal with kind of coping strategies and stuff in general life. Because as you know, like horror films, they have a basis of a reflection of either society or very personal factors or cultural issues and stuff like that, and they bring that in so much better than a lot of other films do. But the difference between watching a horror film and watching, say, like a true life documentary about it is that you have the separation of knowing that it's not real. You're able to then, when you're in the midst of it and scared, you get straight into the fight or flight response, and you know your heartbeat increases and everything. And then when either the filmmaker brings in a bit of humor or there's like maybe different factors into it, you immediately know it's not real. But then also at the end of it, things get resolved. Whereas in life, maybe things don't get resolved so quickly, or at least within a 2 hour time frame. So you're able to then go completely relaxed. Things have been sorted, and then dopamine gets actually released to your system. So you actually have a feel good factor after. So like it actually kind of,
Yeah. Okay. So, because I've seen a few people online being like, I don't understand why horror fans are so obsessed with horror, and it's kind of like, well, there's a science behind it, you know. It's actually like a form of therapy almost, and that's what I find. Like when I'm feeling particularly stressed or depressed, putting on a horror, it makes me feel. It sounds a bit twisted. It makes me feel really good afterwards. I feel just like this release, and it just feels amazing. Like as weird as it sounds.
No, because I was reading an article the other day, and they were saying that people that love horror or have like morbid curiosity have actually been doing better with dealing with the pandemic at the moment than say people who don't like that kind of stuff, because they kind of have built up quite a lot of resilience and stuff like that through watching a lot of these films. And it's just quite funny because I get that a lot as well, of like, well, why would you watch this if you're stressed? Would it not stress you more? And I'm like, well, no, because I know it's not real, and I can have a look at like it's either humorous or it's campy, depending on when, like, what era you're watching, or
Yeah.
and it's just, yeah, it's just fascinating, and it's always just a different perspective of looking at the factors that affect all of us.
Exactly.
And sure, also, if you're kind of into survival, like horror and stuff like that, or zombie movies and stuff, we've seen multiple pandemics happen.
We're living a zombie pandemic at the moment. Like, you know, George A. Romero could not have written this. Like, we're there. So going back to a point you made about horror reflecting society, especially social politics, the topic I picked for us to discuss movies within that genre was actually female killers, which I thought, which I thought was a really good topic for us to discuss. So in your line of study, or what you've kind of studied, female killers or female villains, what is the psychology behind it? Have you noticed any patterns with female killers that may have mirrored what we are going to be talking about in these particular two horror films that we've watched?
Yeah, so in terms of, let's say, the difference between gendered crimes, like female killers and female villains, they are a lot more rare. However, they're more sensationalized through media, stuff like that, because it's seen as, oh, women can't do that, and women aren't like this. They're a virginal figure, or
we're meant to be sweet, motherly, you know, maternal kind of. How could we ever take a life when we're meant to give life?
And it's that kind of thing of, it's not feminine to express yourself this way, or to react this way. You're meant to just swallow it and move on, as many women are told that's what you have to do when you're faced with certain factors. There's a lot of different factors depending on what the kind of crime was and who the victim is of the female killers and stuff like that. But a lot of the time it tends to be kind of, they are wronged in some way, usually multiple different ways, quite horrific, usually quite sexualized, is the main theme. And then that's where it comes out of, is just that they haven't been able to deal with it properly. They're feeling wronged by the world, and then it ends up coming out in this more extreme form of things. I always find it fascinating, like, looking at how horror films do depict women, and I think, especially as a genre of all of them, it actually is the most female friendly, although it sounds weird. But especially in the last good few decades, it's tilted where it's all about female protagonists, and essentially they're always still victims, and they have to be victims, but yet they turn it around and they survive now, instead of just being killed off the bat because they had sex or whatever. So I think it's kind of a fascinating twist on it. It's also, it kind of reflects the growing feminism and equality that's coming out in the world now as well, and it's kind of always been reflective of it. And even just a simple fact of, in horror films, women actually have more representation and just essentially just speak more in film than any other film. Even romantic genres, which are meant to be made for women, we speak less than the male counterparts.
That's a really good point, and I definitely think it's something that we're going to touch on, especially with the film that you've chosen. So I think we're going to start off with your film, and you chose Audition. Directed by Takashi Miike. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. So do you want to give us a brief synopsis on Audition?
Yeah, of course. So it was made in 1999. It is a Japanese horror, and from the same director who made The Ring. Essentially, there is a man who, in the first 5 minutes of film, we find out that his wife has died. And then it jumps straight away to 7 years later. And his son is asking him, why won't you get married again? You're looking very worn out. So he speaks to a friend of his who essentially runs auditions for getting parts for movies. And his friend says, well, if you feel like you want someone, I can basically make auditions. You can have a pick of hundreds of women of who you'd like to audition, and then you can find your wife through there.
It sounds like a really bad rom-com kind of start, doesn't it? If you didn't think it was horror, you definitely think it was a rom-com, like one of those cringy ones.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, oh, here's a catalog. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. When at first, like the main character in the film, he's kind of a bit reluctant about it. He feels bad. He's thinking this isn't great, but like there's so many, like, I wouldn't even say overtones of misogyny and everything like that, and very sexist and stuff. And they try and play it off kind of humorous and whatever. And
like a bad rom-com again, like you see the amount of romantic comedy kind of plots, and it's just men being horribly misogynistic, but it's funny and it's okay.
The thing is, I think the director was kind of going along those lines, because the movie that they'd be auditioning for was meant to be a romantic film. So I just thought that was quite good. Like, but so essentially he finds one, he's fascinated by her, really likes her. The friend isn't very keen, he's quite off-put by her, thinks there's something wrong, but he just falls madly in love very quickly. But we're even shown, like the audience is even shown that like there's something off with her, you know. She sits in an abandoned building, she doesn't move for days waiting for his phone calls, and she kind of opens up to him about a lot of things. But that kind of continues for quite a bit of time. Like the first hour and a bit is just a buildup of things. There, you know, there's some strange things that happen throughout it. I won't go into too much detail with it, but you know,
it's okay. We can go into spoiler detail.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna put a warning. We're going into spoilerific detail here, so you can spoil away.
So yeah, like when the kind of tone and the pacing of the movie changes, because it's quite slow, is when they go away for a weekend together and he wants to propose to her. Now, I mean, they've met like barely,
right? That is fast.
And essentially, she kind of shows him scars on her leg, and it's the first sign that we get kind of an inkling into the fact that she's been abused before. And then essentially they sleep together, but when he wakes up, she's gone. And he kind of almost seems like he's in this kind of drugged out state, and he can't really remember anything. And he starts panicking because he can't get in contact with her. He's never been to her home. He only has the phone number. All of her references that she had used before never checked out. And so he went to go look for her in a place that she said she worked. He got there and a neighbor said, well, this person's been dead for a year, and he doesn't recognize the description of the woman that that the main character was talking about. And essentially it was a very gruesome killing, which involved like removal of feet and a tongue and an ear, and but there was also extra body parts that were left as well. And at this point, the main character, he also starts hallucinating quite a lot of different things. So you're kind of left wondering, oh, I wonder what is fact, what's, you know, what's hallucination. And it all starts then just getting a lot more weird.
It gets weirder.
And you've just kind of launched into, he somehow is then able to like see and meet people that have been a part of this woman's life, and I'm not going to pronounce names because I know I'll get it wrong.
It's Asami.
I think
Asami. Asami is the woman, and Ayami is the man. I think like that's how I'm choosing to pronounce it. I'm really, really sorry if it's wrong.
I just chosen not to. But yeah, so essentially we're shown that she went to ballet school for a number of years, but she was severely abused by the teacher, who used to masturbate while watching her dance. He burnt her leg.
Really gross individual. Like
it was intense. And like he had like sewn on prosthetic feet, which later on you realize was from like her stepfather. Essentially she was just a victim of constant abuse by people that were meant to be looking after her in multiple different ways. And it's interesting because the conversations that they had towards the start of the film, you actually see later on in the film that they went a lot more into the abuse, but he was just like, oh, just if it upsets you, don't talk about it. And so we didn't get to see that at the start. It was only when things started unraveling that we actually get to see a deeper understanding of what's going on with her.
Yeah.
Which I thought was quite fascinating. And then and then it is the last like 15 minutes of the film that it goes from slow pace, kind of humorous, then it goes into just a bit more like, okay, what's fact, what's reality, what's going on. And then he's in his home, and she has been there, she's seen a picture of his ex-wife, and her main thing was, you need to love me and no one else. She sees the picture, she becomes enraged, and she drugs his drink. He sits down on the couch, has a drink, and immediately starts feeling the effects. He goes to stand up and he falls down, and then she appears. And essentially she is dressed in, like, she always wore white, and this one she has big black leather gloves and a big apron, and you're just like, oh no.
It reminded me a lot of American Mary by the Soska sisters. Like, they have very obviously I assume the Soska sisters was very influenced by Audition, because there's a lot of parallels between the two films. But yeah, she kits out in her like fucking dominatrix gear with the leather apron and the leather gloves, and you know, she really comes into herself in the last 15 minutes.
Really does. And like, yeah, so essentially she starts like torturing him. She has drugged him with like a paralytic drug, so he's paralyzed, but his nerves actually feel more intense pain now because the fact he's paralyzed. So the torture is even worse than if he was actually just not paralyzed. And she's just basically explaining, like, you told me you'd love me and no one else, but yet you have a son, and yet you had a wife, and you have this housekeeper who you probably, you know, slept with, and been other women in your life. And so she just basically said, you're like all the rest of them, which would, you know, back to the fact of the other people that were meant to love her and protect her didn't. And yeah, so she tortures him. She gets rid of one of his feet with piano wire, and that is just, it's one of those scenes like, oh my God.
And like every now and then with the torture scenes, it kind of cuts away so you don't hear it, but then when you actually see it, it's so visceral, and it's like, oh, like, it's like something you can feel almost. You're just like, oh.
Oh, exactly. And I think especially when you become so desensitized to movies that like when you see something that still makes you go, oh.
Yeah, I mean, you can watch all the stabbings and whatever all you like, but when you see something like cutting off a body part with piano wire, or even when she's sticking the needles and she goes under his eyes, something about feet and eyes, you're just like,
I love the way that it was just when she go deeper, which was like ticka 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 ticka, and she always was doing it, and I was just like, I don't know why I'm smiling, but it's like ticka ticka ticka.
I think it's because it was so childlike. Like, she reverts back to this childlike state while torturing him, and it's so weird and creepy, and I think the only thing you can do is kind of laugh at it.
But yeah, it's fascinating. And then essentially the son comes home, and she gets interrupted. She's trying to attack him with mace, but he ends up kicking her down the stairs, and she breaks her neck. And then the final scenes are essentially like the main character, he's looking at her while he's still on the floor and he's still not fully able to move, and her neck is broken, but she turns and she's talking to him and repeating the fact that you're meant to love me and no one else, and she goes back to this dialogue again, and then the movie just ends.
That's it. There's no resolution, it just ends. And you kind of sit there for a while after it's finished, and you're like, you're like, I have so many questions. So I think for me anyway, watching this film, the main theme was like toxic masculinity. Like, you see from Asami's childhood how that toxic masculinity shaped her into who she became. And then you see another form of the toxic masculinity where it's these two men thinking they can have auditions to find the perfect subservient woman, and that they can trick them, and you know, the woman should be okay with that, and they should love them anyway. And then you even see it when Aoyami, his son, brings home a girl, and his dad like cheers him on as if this girl is like a prize to be won, and you know, it's like, yeah, go on my son. Obviously not like that, because he's not like an East End Londoner. You know, it's very overt toxic masculinity. And like you said before, when you were discussing female killers, most of the time females kill because of abuse and because of toxic masculinity, and you know, and it's really prevalent in this film. Is that something you'd agree with?
Oh, 100%. Like, I think a lot of the themes that they basically put on was, you know, the oppression of particularly Japanese females,
Yeah.
within the society, because it like, you know, I can't generalize right now, but like the way that it was portrayed in the film is that, you know, it is very much that it's a very misogynist and sexist kind of societal cultural factors within that, and it hits on those factors and also brings in the fact that like it turns her from this idyllic, always pure, wearing white, and she's very subservient, and she's very like the ideal woman essentially. And then immediately you're switched at the very end to, no, she's actually a very, very, I don't like the word scorned, but you know, she's someone who suffered an awful lot. And then it's turned her into what would be deemed as like a monster or unfeminine or whatever, because she is getting back at what has happened to her in her life. Now, it's not all basically about toxic masculinity in terms of, she did have female victims. She also had female, like I think it was her uncle's wife who she stayed with also was very abusive to her. So she's actually just had full round abuse, but the main theme is the fact of the misogyny and the fact that they just presume these women should be grateful that they're given the opportunity to possibly be someone's like partner. And it's just, I think it's a fascinating look at things. The way it turns things on their head in terms of like what you're supposed to expect and what you're supposed to deal with. And I think it just shows you that you can't expect to not have consequences for acting this way and for ideas. And I think a lot of like the main characters, his hallucinations and stuff actually had a lot of guilt to it.
That's right.
He was starting to feel like, oh, this isn't right, and I shouldn't have treated women this way. And that was towards the end of what was happening to him. So like, and she even stated that it's only when you're in pain that you truly see what you've done to other people or how you have been in your life. And like, that was a really interesting take on it. And I think it's quite accurate too. Like,
I mean, she draws this comparison between love and pain. And obviously, because of the way she's grown up, she's only known pain, but her abusers have said it was love, you know? So when she's dating now, this guy causes her pain, but it must be love because he says it's love. And, you know, he wanted to propose to her straight away. And I think that's really interesting, especially when you look at perhaps a Freudian, this is going really deep, but perhaps looking at Freudian, you know, Freud believed that there was contact and, you know, a connection between eros, which is love, sexuality, pleasure, and thanatos, which is death, but death also violence, destruction, sadism. And I really like the way the film kind of draws on that kind of subject as well. And she even says it, she's like, you know, you only love me and I love you, so I'm going to cause you this pain, and then you'll realize, you know. So I enjoyed that. And I think especially with the other film we're going to be discussing, that's also a theme, that female killers, there's this thing that it's like the line between love and pain is blurred, and that's a great subject. But there's another thing about Asami's torture. It's almost like she's demanding to be seen. That when you said that when they were having their dates and he only saw, you know, the good conversation, and we don't see that she had actually talked about her abuse until later on in the film. And it's like he just decided to block that out, to not let her be anything other than his perfect idea of woman, and that this torture is her demand to be seen. And I mean, obviously asking your professional opinion, do you feel that that's a lot of what female killers kind of do. It's like they demand to be seen anything other than perfect. This is how they're going to deal with this situation, and it's not going to be typically feminine, you know?
Yeah, like I do think so. I think like what you were saying about the fact that there's the blurred lines between love and pain,
Mhm.
because a lot of the time the abusers will say that like, oh, I'm doing this because I love you,
Yeah.
even if it's causing pain. And the thing is like it does become inseparable for them.
Mhm.
And then it's so hard for them to understand what is actually people being kind or whatever, that maybe there's
Right.
another agenda. And a lot of the time, yeah, it is the fact that like women are victims and they're not allowed to speak out, and they're not allowed, especially because in terms of abuse, most of the time it's someone that they know or that they're very
Yeah.
close to, their family members, etc. So they're not allowed to speak out. They're not allowed to speak out, have a voice, and this is the only way that they can kind of, just after years and years of just constant abuse and torture, that they will meet not only in that one particular abusive scenario, but throughout
Yeah.
their life in many different aspects. And it kind of gets mirrored over and over again, that this is how they finally just go, hang on a second, this is me. I am just, it's kind of like the avenging angel type of thing. And that they just go, no, I'm sick of being repressed, oppressed, everything, and I'm finally going to stand up for myself. And it just so happens that it is a more violent means of a way to do it. Like even
Yeah.
if you look at Eileen Wuornos, who was one of the most prolific female serial killers, she essentially was just so done with having to constantly protect herself in an industry that women are never protected in, such as the sex industry. And she was being treated so horrendously that her first killing was actually self-defense.
Yeah.
And that just went on from there. But it opened up a whole new world for her of just going, well, I can actually take my power back, and this is how I'm going to go and do it.
Yeah.
And essentially, she was a victim her entire life, and this was how she found her power. And this is how she finally was able to talk about these kind of things when she was caught and everything like that.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so I think that is going to bring us on to the next film. So that film was Audition. It's a great film. I'd recommend it. Would you recommend it?
Oh, 100%. I think if you haven't seen it, it's kind of, it's one of the ones that gets listed constantly
Oh
as
God,
like
yeah.
hard
The most
directed.
influential. Yeah.
Yeah. So 100%. I think it's just great. I think, you know, the slow pace at the start, the way that you're kind of, the audience is kind of just lulled into this false sense of security
Yeah.
and then it just goes bam.
Yeah.
Like,
it's like tricked you. Yeah, because I don't usually like slow paced films. I get a bit bored. I have a really bad attention span, but actually this keeps you going because you're like, okay, it seems all nice, but I know it's not. I know something's going to happen. So it's like it builds this tension. And I think it's so great to look at it as an influential horror film because, again, you can see direct parallels with American Mary, again, who is abused. And then she takes revenge and she finds her calling in this sort of revenge and she finds her power.
Hello, I am just interrupting my little conversation with forensic psychologist Emma Tyrrell to tell you all about the song that you heard at the beginning of this podcast. It is a song called Afraid of Me by a great band called Cadaver Club. They are a funeral punk quartet from Ireland, and you can find them on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and at their website, cadaverclub.com.
So the next film was the film that I chose. It's a film that I only found out about sometime last year from another podcast called Evolution of Horror, which is really good. It details the history of horror. And it is Alice, Sweet Alice. And it is a 1976 film written and co-directed by Alfred Sol. And it's kind of, along with Black Christmas, it was a precursor to slashers and what we now define as a slasher horror film. Have you seen it?
I have. It's one that I watch like every 2 years.
Yeah.
So I love it. It's just absolutely messed up, but it's great.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost got a Giallo-esque feel to it. You know, it's not quite slasher. It's a procedural kind of film, but again, it has its roots. It is the roots of a slasher. So I'll give a quick synopsis of it. And again, there are going to be spoilers because we discuss all this. So it starts off, there are two sisters, one of which is Brooke Shields in her earliest role. And then we have Paula Shepherd, who plays the titular role, Alice. So they're two girls. Alice is the older one, and they are with their mother, and they're part of a Catholic family. And the younger one, Karen, is doing her first communion. Yeah. So it starts off, and we see from the get-go that the family do not have a great relationship. Alice is seen as a black sheep. She's seen as a bit of a pain in the arse, whereas Karen is the golden child. You know, she cannot do no wrong. She's given gifts by the priest, which is a little bit creepy. We never find out what relationship is with the priest and the mother, but they're very close. And I don't know whether I'm coming at this from like an Irish Catholic view, that I'm like, that's a little bit weird. But very early on, I think it's within the first 15 minutes, Karen is brutally murdered just before she does her Holy Communion, and she's murdered in the church. And it doesn't cut away. We see the full view of this child being murdered. And it's something that most horror films would shy away from, would be showing the death of a child. But she's brutally murdered by an assailant with the yellow raincoat on, which all the children wear who come from this particular church, and a mask, which is like, it's an old 70-ish mask, but it's got like painted woman kind of, so it's got bright red lips, bright blue eyes, and then she's stuffed into a box, like under a pew kind of thing. Yeah. She's stuffed in there, and a candle is lit, and basically it goes on fire. It attracts the attention of all the churchgoers, and they find this little girl has been killed. And in the meantime, no one knows where Alice is. And then she comes back, and the mother's dealing with her, and then her aunt comes rushing up and is like, your daughter's dead. So it kind of goes from there. We see how badly Alice is almost treated within this family. And there is also, her dad isn't part of the picture. He's fecked off and married some other young one. And her mum basically has to hold the whole thing together. And then there's a creepy neighbor as well. He lives downstairs. He's the landlord. He lives downstairs. And like, I mean, we'll get more onto his character, I think, in the next few minutes. But there's a few more killings. So this murderer attacks her aunt, then kills the neighbor, kills the dad when he comes back into town. And then we find out that it is the priest's housekeeper. And it's shown quite early on. It's revealed quite early on who the killer is, which is kind of strange. And then there's this whole thing where like Alice gets sent to a center. Well, what do they call it, like an asylum or something? But obviously that's not the correct termage anymore. Yeah, yeah, and she's like kind of looked after by child psychologists because everyone thinks there's something wrong with her. And in the meantime, the dad is trying to find out what happened. And so it's the titular character, she's not the killer, but she displays certain psychopathic tendencies. There's just so much to unpack about this film. There really is. Many themes. You've got this like anti-Catholic theme running through it. Apparently the director was an ex-Catholic, and that it was actually, this film was actually banned in Ireland because of its anti-Catholic themes. That's how bad it is. You've got this like creepy priest. You've got these like holier than thou women. And in fact, it's found out that the killer, Mrs. Tredoni, who is the housekeeper, she's killing people because she feels that they're sinners and they need to be punished. So yeah, there's just a lot. And obviously we've got a lot of child abuse. Again, a lot of child abuse, a lot of neglect. So yeah, how did you feel about this film in the terms of like female villains and killers?
Yeah, like I found it I watched it like many years ago, and a lot of that, like when I was younger, I just kind of went whoop.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, no, I find it fascinating. I find the fact that like it explores so many different types of relationships between women and young girls and stuff
Yeah.
like that. It's not only just like with the difference between the different male characters, it was just a lot about mothers and children.
Yeah.
Like, the fact that that the housekeeper, she had her own ideas about what was right and wrong and
Right.
one
Yeah.
and like it was quite fascinating seeing the female perspective of different things actually shown quite a lot,
Yeah.
and like through such a really horrific and graphic like film.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've always found it fascinating. I find the mask itself to be just such an interesting thing because it essentially is seen as like a very feminine
Yeah.
face in terms of it's the most unnerving thing ever.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of masks. They
It's
freak
really
me out.
creepy. And there's like a bit where in the very beginning where Alice is trying to run away from her little sister, and her sister follows her into an abandoned warehouse, and then Alice jumps out at her and she's got that mask on, and then she takes it off and she's got like an old crone's mask underneath. And it's like the whole, like, a big theme in this film is growing up from childhood to adulthood. You know, during the film we find out that Alice has had her first period, but yet she didn't let her mother know, so she's obviously ashamed of this natural thing that's been happening. And especially within the Catholic Church, there is such a judgment on females, and especially when it comes to like menstruation and puberty and just being a woman. So that was a really interesting thing with the masks as well. Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of the fact that like it looks at all the different themes that are actually brought up quite a lot within horror films.
Yeah.
Which is the menstruation, which is puberty, which is sex and relationships and like femininity and what being a woman is.
Exactly.
And like
especially in slasher films. Yeah.
100%. Like, so I thought this film for when it was made just kind of hit the like mark with so many different factors. It did it so well, and also sometimes quite subtly. It wasn't always in your face, but like when you reflected on it, you're like, wow, they really explored so many themes that it's about being a woman and the difficulties. And then that kind of ties in with what I was saying about the different relationships between like females and stuff, and especially when you do bring in the Catholic Church into what is deemed like right and wrong and sinful, how people should be, and how these devout women would go against their own family and their own daughters by saying this is how you have to be and you can't be any other way, you know?
Yeah. I mean, one of the very first lines from the mother is, "Why can't you act like a lady?" And I think with this film, with a lot of female-centric antagonists, and with Audition, it's all about female performance and how we should act, and that there are two sides to the typical traditional female, that there's one side that we have to put out, and then we have to, obviously we don't, like I definitely don't, but in the past you have to put out a front and wear a mask and come across as this lady and this perfect woman and perfect like Christian woman, and then there's who we are behind that. And it's like the same with Audition, the same with even stuff like Carrie. You know, it's like, again, we have the holy themes in Carrie as well, and having to be like the perfect Christian woman. And I found that really good in Alice, Sweet Alice, that it really portrayed that thing of female performance.
Yeah. No, definitely.
Another kind of thing that I found in Alice, Sweet Alice was, like, as you were saying, the relationship between female family members. I mean, you've got the aunt who is this shrill, controlling, emotionally abusive woman, and she is just so, but we all know someone like that, you know, that she thinks she's holier than thou. And she's really quite abusive to Alice. You know, she keeps pushing her mother to, like, you know, give her what for, and to punish her almost for how she is, whereas Alice is just trying to find herself, and she is a teenager. She's becoming a teenager, and we all know how hard the teenage years are, what with hormones, you know, social kind of standings, a lot of people believe that teenagers should be seen and not heard, whereas that's not how teenagers are. They're trying to find their own way in the world. Whereas this woman is here to really kind of break Alice down. And then there's the mother who, while she does want to be supportive to her daughter, but she's also trying to like still be what society thinks she should be.
Yeah.
And then you've got Mrs. Tredoni, who is like, she's taken on a caretaker role, but it's almost like, again, the lines are blurred for her between caretaking for the priests and for the Catholic parish. And that's turned to murder for her, because she believes that she has to kill these sinners for the priest, for God, you know, for all that is holy. And I think that's really interesting that in this film there are so many strong female characters, not necessarily good female characters, but they're there. And especially for a film for the 70s, that they showed these complex female characters. And I think that's why I love this film so much. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I think, as I was saying before, like, it, you know, horror has like only started tilting, you know, like in the last couple of decades towards more female empowerment and representation and bringing in those themes. But like this film was like really like a forefront of looking at the fact that, like, yes, it's showing the good and the bad side of what strong females are, showing the tough side of trying to balance being a mother, but also balance being what you think society tells you should be. You know, as you said about being a teenager and trying to find your place in the world, trying to find your voice, but you're not allowed. And what can you do? And because you're already coined as the black sheep. So, you know, those kind of things of when you're already told that this is what you are, and you know, there's something wrong with you and all that kind of stuff, you're going to believe it, and you're going to go down that kind of road. And then you see like the angelic like sister Karen, who's just seen as like this perfect queen, and yet Alice is going through all these changes. And I just like, and especially like when it came to like the caretaker as well, for her it was all about absolutes. Like there was no other way to deal with this but just eradicate the people that are doing massive sin. And the fact that it was like absolute devotion, and that it was for others, and it wasn't for really necessarily herself. It had nothing really to do with herself. It was to make sure that God, who, you know, at that point, you know, people would see as like male, and the priest who would be male. And it was all about kind of nearly being the subservient kind of person to go, oh, I'll do this for you, so that, you know what I mean? And it's just, I'd always thought it was really fascinating how it just looked into so many different factors. And I think as well, that's probably why it did get banned in Ireland as well, because it also just has so many females in it. And
I know. I mean, how dare females be anything but quiet little mice? It was I find that quite funny that it was banned in Ireland when I was reading up about it. And you just think, oh my gosh. And like it's so funny because for anyone outside of Ireland, we still have these typical Catholic the Catholic fear, the Catholic guilt in Ireland. And I think only like people that have grown up in a Catholic culture can kind of look at this film and be like, yeah, I kind of get it. Like, I know those women, and I know that priest, and I know that housekeeper who was so devoted to the priests that she would almost do anything for them and not question it, because they're men of God, and this must be what God wants. And another thing I found quite interesting in the film is all the men. Like, they're such shitheads in the film. I mean, you've got the priest who was maybe the only one, but he still had that weird relationship with the children that you're like, okay, that's crossing a line, you know. And we're never told that relationship. Like, was he a family friend? Is something going on with the mother? Like, they seem to be very close, and you're just like, ooh. But there's another thing that we find kind of similarities with films like Audition, American Mary, and Alice, Sweet Alice, is the female characters are surrounded by disgusting, abusive men that, even though they are in positions of where they should be taking care of this person, they abuse that power. I mean, we see it with the cops when the police take Alice into custody and they're giving her a lie detector test, and one of the cops goes, "Did you see her tits? It looked as if she wanted me to touch them." And you're like, she's a 12-year-old girl and you're saying this. Like, it's disgusting. Like, no wonder Alice has developed these tendencies that are almost a defense mechanism and to protect herself. And we see it especially in the relationship with their downstairs neighbor, who is their landlord. I mean, we're going to put aside, this film has very fatphobic tendencies when it comes to this character. So I'm going to put that aside, because obviously it was the 70s and, you know, they had this whole idea that fat is gross, but that's not, you know, that's not the case. So we're going to put that bit aside, because I would like to just, you know, we'll address it, but it's not the main thing when it comes to this character. But he lives alone and he's got a million cats again, which is fine. Like, I would love to be surrounded by that many cats. But he's so creepy and he's perverted. And he has this like one-on-one with Alice where they go back and forth and she's really cruel and abusive to him and he's being creepy towards her. And then there's one scene where she goes down to give him rent and he tries to molest her. And the only way she can get away from it is if she grabs one of his cats and hurts his cats. But it's this thing of like, no wonder she's so cold and cruel. She has to be to protect herself. And I think that's a big theme when it comes to female villains and killers. Is they have to be, because they have to protect themselves. What was your kind of thinking on the neighbor and his character? Like, it really grossed me out.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, like for him, I thought it was like the quintessential kind of you know, like there used to be like stranger danger kind of thing.
Right.
But
Yeah.
there was a quintessential thing of like, there is a male in the life of this person and, you know, they know them sort of well and stuff like that. The fact that she would have to go down by herself to his place when, you know, she knows that it's not a safe space, it's not comfortable, things aren't going to be good. Like, it is just, they did a very good job at just kind of honing in on the kind of the language that's used and just the general overall demeanor of the person, of just being just like, you're like, ugh. And the reason you get creeped out by it is that you've probably either seen it or felt it or heard of someone who's also had a similar scenario.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Not like having to hurt a cat to get out of there, but you know, like just, or even just the conversations and the way that they're spoken
exactly. We've all had a boss. We've all had a creepy neighbor, creepy family member. Like, everyone, like, knows someone like that.
Exactly. And I think that why it kind of brings out that like factor, because you're just, oh, I know what that's like, you know. And I thought they did a really good job. I found it so fascinating. Like, as you said, like, it was an early kind of reveal of who the actual killer was. But with all the male characters in it, you'd still always go, I wonder, like, before, like, you know, they were like murdered and stuff. Like, I still wonder, are they a part of it? Or they do, you know, you're just like, oh, like, you wouldn't be surprised if they were a part of it or if they were another killer or, do you know what I mean? Like, there was no, like, part of it where you were just like, oh, that poor man. Like,
exactly. Like, when the neighbor gets killed, you're kind of like, yes. You know, it's kind of like the killer, she's almost like an avenging angel. Like, you know, she knows, she obviously knows that the abuse is going on, and she wants to kill him, and she does. And, you know, when you kind of don't hate Mrs. Tredoni, you know, a lot of the time when you're watching killer films, say with American Psycho, you kind of hate him. You're kind of like, I really hate you and I hope you get killed or caught out. Whereas a lot of the time with female killers in films, you're cheering them on. Like, I was cheering on in Audition. I was like, yeah, you kill those men. And even in this, you're like, yeah, Mrs. Trononi, like, sometimes, you know. And even with, I mean, American Mary, I know I keep referencing it, it is one of my favorite films because of that exact reason, that she tortures her rapist, and you just think, yes, come on, like, go you go, Glen Coco. But, and even it just seems all the men don't really get a good comeuppance in this film, which is great. The dad, you know, he's he's an absent dad. He just kind of left and married someone else and is rarely even there. You know, the aunt even says at one point, oh, I'm glad he's shown up to his own I'm surprised he's shown up to his own daughter's funeral, you know. So we see that he's not that great, even though he is kind of portrayed as a bit of a hero. You know, he's that typical hero character, but he's not really. You know, he cheats on his wife with his ex-wife, and then he's trying to put all the blame onto his niece. And he ends up getting killed as well. And even the priest gets stabbed at the end, you know, or he gets his throat cut or something like that, doesn't he? Yeah. So like none of the men have a good outcome in this.
No.
And,
it looks at the flawedness of each of the characters, and then each of them gets some sort of comeuppance for something. You know what I mean? So it's quite interesting.
Yeah. But I feel like I don't know about you. There's a lot of questions about these kind of films and whether they're feminist or are they misogynistic, you know, especially with Audition. There's this big question mark over, is this a feminist film or is it a misogynistic film? You know, which way should we be looking at it? And I kind of feel that with Alice, Sweet Alice, there is very strong feminist tones, but not in the way that it's like, woo, proud, strong women. It's more like, this is women outside of our performance. We might not be strong, we might be weak, but we're multifaceted. We're not just 2D, you know? And I think from that perspective, Audition and Alice, Sweet Alice are feminist films, even though they were both made by men. How do you feel these two films especially kind of go when it comes to whether they're feminist or misogynistic?
Yeah, it's a tough one. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think what's interesting for me, and the reason that it kind of comes across with the more feminist point of view, is that like normally, you know, a lot of the time, like women are naive, powerless, and a bit trivial, kind of the way that, you know, portrayed and stuff like that. Whereas this kind of flips everything on its head and just goes, well, actually, no, they're not powerless anymore, and they're actually finding power in a different way. As you said, like it's not about like the women's performance and what we're told we have to do. It's actually showing what can happen and what does happen if people are like kind of like abused in all these different ways, be it emotional, psychological, physical, sexual, everything. And it shows the different factors and how each of those different types of abuse even have a different reaction,
right?
And consequences as well. I feel that, like, you know, they do tend more on the feminist side of the scale. I think because of the fact that they address quite a lot of the misogynistic side of things is also like really important. You know, it's not just, oh, here's some female empowerment film of just like, oh, look at them and they get to like, you know, do what they need to do. It's like, well, actually we're going to address the reasons behind everything. And then also, just as I said before, it gives them a voice, and horror films, particularly these ones, have finally given them a voice or given them a means to get their power back in one way. So yeah, I think like probably more on the scale of feminism.
I mean, that's not to say that these films are technically perfect examples of feminist cinema, because again, they are from the perspective of men, because they're both directed by men and all the dialogue is mainly male, and a lot of the time the female dialogue and the female action is based around the actions of men, or it's talking about the men, or it's because of the men. So it's not technically, it's not a great piece of feminist cinema. You know, I think you'd need more of a female kind of viewpoint for that kind of thing. But when it comes to themes and storyline, then yeah, they do have feminist themes. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all we can talk about when it comes to, I mean, we could talk about so much more, but we'd be here all day when it comes to like feminist cinema. So which film out of the two do you feel best addresses our topic of female killers?
Oh, that's a tough one.
All right. Because that's the whole point of this, to find out which out of the two is the best.
Oh.
If you could only recommend one of them.
Oh God. If I could recommend one of them, I think it would be Alice, Sweet Alice.
Yeah, same.
I think it has so much more different themes that run through it, so much more different analysis that you can break down from it, and it's just, I'd go with that one.
Yeah, same. I think because it is a precursor to one of the biggest subgenres of horror, the slasher film, is that you kind of need to see it at its roots. And it's also very influenced by Giallo, which is another great subgenre of horror and a precursor to slasher. And it just has so many themes. And although I love Audition because it is one of the most influential horror films of all time, I definitely think Alice, Sweet Alice is the winner. Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner. So that is, for anyone wondering, Audition, which is a Japanese horror. Go check that out. And Alice, Sweet Alice, which is a 70s American flick, which everyone should go check out. And it definitely made me want a yellow raincoat after that. I mean, they were styling.
Yeah.
So before I let you go, I would like to know, what is your favorite horror film?
So it's not anything profound. Like, I know a lot of people probably think it's like kind of Silence of the Lambs or any kind of psychological horror.
Yeah. I mean, before we came on, I did try and guess, and I was going like The Shining. What else did I say? Any of the Universal horror. And you were like, no, stop guessing. Just quit it.
It's one of those things. It's like, the thing is, like, all of those films, such as like The Shining, The Birds, like Psycho, like everything, they are all my favorite. But the problem is, as well, with horror, there's so many subgenres that, like, you'd nearly have to pick a favorite from each one. But overall, like, the movie I keep coming back to, and like it actually has a psychological basis as to like why I keep coming back to it, is essentially, and we were talking about the roots of slashers. So mine was the revival film of slashers, which was Scream. So I just love it. I love that it kind of reinvented it again. Like, it kind of got to the stage that there was just so many slashers and so many sequels. It got quite watered down. People were kind of like, this is the end of this kind of genre. And then Scream came out and just went, nah, do you know what? We're going to give our characters some actual kind of like realization and like critical skills and awareness.
Yeah, it's very meta.
Yeah. It's just humorous, it's fun. But the thing is, as I mentioned before, I hate masks, and masks scare me. I like, it's very funny, as like, you know, as a psychologist, I know that everybody has multiple masks in real life. But seeing an actual representation of a mask that they do, and it's usually creepy, it's like, when I cannot see someone's face, it unnerves me so much because I can't tell what they're thinking, which is what a psychologist needs to do, you know? Always my thing. But my favorite thing about it is that actually I use Scream as a way of exposure therapy. So I watched it when I was 8 at a Halloween party, where all the older kids were watching it and I was watching it. It was my first like experience of watching a full-on like horror film. That wasn't through a cracked door and I had to run upstairs if someone got up. Then I had to walk home by myself in the middle of the night.
No.
And then to get up into my room, on the stairs there was this like poster of Scream. And so I had to run through it. Then I got into my bed and I was shaking and I just couldn't believe what I'd seen, and it was all just so much. And then I had a wardrobe that had slats in it, you know, like a horror film would have. And I'd forgotten that I left something in my wardrobe, and all I hear is, "I see you." Oh my God. And it was my Furby who I'd locked in there earlier. But I mean, I've never jumped out of my skin so much. And the thing is, all those like extra things after watching the film made me more terrified of it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
As I was growing up in my teenage years, friends found out about it.
Yeah.
And then they would chase me around the local parks.
Oh,
Scream
girl.
fake like knives and stuff, and I was like, ah. So a couple years ago I went, all right, do you know what, I'm gonna try and face my fears, because I love the story, I love the way they've done it, and I just loved everything about the Scream movie.
Yeah.
And so I was like, but I really want to watch it without being so terrified of the
Yeah.
mask all the time. So then I did my own form of exposure therapy, which is really good for anxiety if it's done appropriately.
Yeah.
And essentially it's just exposing yourself to the stimuli that you're terrified of, and it helps people
Okay.
with anxiety, OCD, and PTSD and stuff like
Yeah.
that. And so from that I was able to then have a whole new love for it. And although I still get a bit like like, like I just love it. I absolutely love it, and I'm so excited that there's going to be a new one out soon. So.
So my favorite horror film is The Exorcist, and the reason why is because of, I think I have such a fear of possession, but possession's my favorite subgenre of horror. And the reason why is because I'm not religious. We're presented possession as a religious thing. It's either Christian demons and then a Christian fighting it, or I've seen examples of like Jewish demons, or religions from the continent of Africa and their take on possession. Even you can say the zombie kind of tradition from Haiti was almost like a possession-ish. And the reason why I'm so scared of possession is because I don't have a religion, I don't have a faith. And so in the unlikely event that a demon decides, you know what, she's the perfect host body, I'm going to possess that bitch, how am I going to fight it? Am I going to be like, here, look, rent stew, hun, out? Like there's not, I mean, I could feed it lots of peanut butter cups and maybe that would put it off or something. I don't know. I've got no way of fighting this demon. And I think that's why I have such a love of possession films, is because I'm secretly quite scared of them. And the first time I ever watched The Exorcist, I mean, it was dated. I mean, it's a great film. It's kind of dated. And so I found it quite funny at the same time, but it scared me deep down because I had all these questions like, what would you do? Like, even in the film, Reagan and her mother, they're not religious. She's quite anti-religion. But yet they have to get a priest to come save her. And I'm like, well, I think I'm fecked. And the first night I watched it, there was some foxes outside mating. And I don't know if anyone's ever heard foxes mating, but they scream. And it scared the shite out of me. And since then, it's almost like the experience shapes what your favorite horror film is, So now everyone knows that I'm really deep-seated scared of being possessed and not having control of my own body, which is subject for another time.
So you also have a deep fear of foxes mating. So
anyone's ever heard foxes mating, you're like, surely they're not enjoying this. Surely this cannot be an enjoyment thing. They scream bloody murder. But yes, so that is going to wrap up our podcast. I would like to thank you so much for being my first guest.
Thank you. Oh, I loved it.
And hopefully we can get you on again.
Definitely, I'd love to. Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much. And that was Emma Tyrrell there, forensic psychologist and one of my good friends. And she was the perfect guest to have on for our very first episode. So thank you so much, Emma, for being a part of it. And thank you so much for listening to the very first episode of What a Scream podcast. This will be going out in the beginning of February, which is also Women in Horror Month. So please check out Women in Horror on Facebook, online. To celebrate Women in Horror, myself and my good friend Sinead Giblin put together a charity calendar, and all proceeds goes towards Messiah Ireland, which helps with the movement of asylum seekers within Ireland and also is helping to end direct provision. So if you would like a calendar, or if you'd like to just get in touch and perhaps have a bit of a discussion or be any way involved in this podcast, please get in touch with me at whatascreampodcast@gmail.com, or on our Facebook, which is What a Scream Podcast, and also on
Instagram. So again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a scream of a day, whatever you're doing, and stay safe and stay horrific. Bye-bye.
Scared of Frankenstein's monster, used to be scared